Good afternoon. My name is Luke Johnson, and I'm a credible scholar, and so is my friend Robert Schut. And today, we're going to be doing installment 4 of Soren Kierkegaard's The Point of View from My Work as an Author, a report to history. How did I do with the whole sounding like a legitimate scholar thing there, Bob? Was that a good intro this time around?
Oh, yeah, you gave us a lot of credibility, I'm sure, and I know you certainly you puffed up my ego, so I'm ready to go now.
Yeah, it's all about the show. Very dedicated to the show. No time for tomfoolery. We have very important things to discuss today. What are we going to be talking about today? Bob is going to be our discussion leader again.
Today, we're going to pick it up on Chapter 3, page 64 from the book that we have here, on the point of view for my work as an author. And we're going to talk about governance, which is kind of an interesting way that Kierkegaard looks. Actually, we're going to cover a lot of ground, but beginning with governance. The title of this little section here is The Share Divine Governance Had in My Authorship. So the first thing to do is decide, what does he mean by governance? And it's the shaping that God's will has on our external lives from without, rather than our internal ones from within. So he says that it wasn't easy for him to write this book because he doesn't like to talk about himself. He does feel the urge, however, to speak about his interest in his relationship with God, although it had an amount of unhappiness in it, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today too, I think. He says that only the beloved can fully understand this love affair that he had with God. And by beloved, I think he means those people who really love his writings, like Luke and myself. And perhaps extended even into Christians who love his writings, can understand his relationship with God. He wanted to prevent a falsehood from being established that would have perhaps brought him money, fame, honor, and applause by pandering to the age. But he would rather present the truth. So confronted with this issue, it looks like he knew of his genius, which we'll talk about also. He knew he was a genius. And he knew that he could have pandered to the public and become somebody extraordinarily famous in his time. And in his time, he really was not somebody who was extraordinarily famous. People knew of him, I believe, but he wasn't really one of the top people there in the public. But he chose instead to represent the truth, to seek the truth and to represent it. I don't think you can do one without the other. I think in going to represent the truth, you have to onwardly seek it. It's an activity that you have to get involved in. And obviously he was in that activity of seeking out the truth. We must never forget that God is love, but God must be worshipped in truth as well. It's easy to forget that God is truth. It's easy to think God is love, and let's just focus on the love aspect of God. And that's an easy sell, kind of, for a lot of people, if we just think of God as love. But it's kind of hard to think of God as righteousness and truth as well. But in John 4:24, that's the Gospel of John, he says, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Now, on page 67, he uses this poetic phrase that I know that's kind of caught you, Luke, because it kind of caught me too. He says, if he had a winged pen, even 10 of them, I could not have followed fast enough to keep pace with the wealth which presents itself. In other words, his thoughts came so fast that he couldn't keep up with them. He was probably just picturing him trying to write as these thoughts came out with an inkwell and a pen. And I don't know, you probably are a little too young to have learned on an inkwell, But when I went to school, we actually learned how to write using an inkwell and a pen.
Did you sign the Declaration of Independence, Bob? Were you one of our founding fathers and you never told me?
You're giving away secrets now. You're giving away secrets. But you got to imagine, though, I'm left-handed. I write left-handed. And liquid ink does not go well when you're trying to write with your left hand. And my penmanship, I never won a penmanship award, let's put it that way. Very difficult to do left-handed. But Kierkegaard was trying to write in that sense. They didn't even have ballpoint pens. It's hard to believe, Luke, right? Didn't even have ballpoint pens at that time. So you can imagine his frustration. But I was just thinking before we started, can you imagine what it would have been like if he lived in an age like today, how much he could have produced with a computer? Because I know I can type a whole lot faster than I can write.
Yes and no. Because at the same time, right, like you got to think about how much of his productivity was the result of being able to shut everything else out, right?
Yeah.
Computers allow us to be incredibly productive with tasks that would have taken, eons in previous eras of history. But it's also very easy to get sucked down into Facebook and YouTube and whatever other mindless shaft there is. So I don't know. Maybe Kierkegaard would have had. I don't know. Maybe he wouldn't have had the discipline if he had all those things provided to him in his home.
Maybe not. Kierkegaard tweeting, that would have been an interesting thing.
Yeah, it might have been hard for Kierkegaard to put down the smartphone.
But he writes every word and every line almost as though he doesn't know that he's writing. But I don't.
Can I real quick? Yeah. I want to add something. I'm sure you know this, but anyone who maybe have just stumbled down the Kierkegaard rabbit hole with us, they may not know this. It's actually kind of funny. Someone on Twitter has slammed the expressions of Soren Kierkegaard together with the tweets of Kim Kardashian. And so there's a Twitter account. About once a year, someone shares it on my Facebook wall. They're like, ha ha ha, Luke will find this really funny. And I'm like, ha ha ha, I saw that 7 years ago. But there's a Twitter account called Kim Kierkegaardashian or something like this, and it's. I'll let me go find it real quick while you go on. I'll read you some of the quotes. You'll find you'll see how hysterical it is. Proceed.
I think that's one of those situations where once I hear it, you can't unring the bell.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't think though when he's talking about writing every line as though he doesn't know that he's writing. Some people might say, "Oh, this is spirit writing," automatic writing. I don't think that's what he's trying to say here. I think he's just saying that he was so far ahead of himself that he just couldn't keep up with his ideas. He was so inspired that his conscious effort could not keep up with his subconscious one. So for somebody so brilliant as him, I think it's understandable him having a hard time trying to write everything that he wrote. I don't know about you, Luke, but I've had similar experiences, only short-lived, but similar experiences as a teacher where I've said things that I've listened to later, and I thought, where did that come from? I didn't even know I knew that. So those are kind of interesting things that I think we experience. I think if we're open to God and we're open to truth, I think we have those experiences. But his experiences were much longer lasting than what my experience have been. But I think I know what he's talking about. Have you had those experiences, like even doing podcasts, that when you listen to them back?
Oh yeah. There's a lot of magic that happens. A lot of unscripted magic. I think that's one of the reasons why people appreciate resources like this is that there's an element of the unpredictable in it. Mm-hmm. I think it raises an interesting question about where unpredictability comes from. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like is what recesses of the mind is is consciousness, the Holy Spirit, whatever you want to call it. What is it reaching into, and how quickly does it do it, and how does it process it all? I think it raises very interesting questions for the neuroscientist and for the theologian alike.
Yeah.
Because it happens at a lightning fast rate.
Yeah, it does. It does.
May I share a Kim Kierkegaardian quote with you?
Okay.
Let me see if I can find one. How cunningly I am able to hide my depression. I literally just put a lot of the shimmer on my face and just walk around. Whoever has learned to be anxious in the right way has the best look for 2017. One more. Let me get a wordy one here. If I can find a wordy one. Hey, come on now. I had a wordy one at the beginning. Those are the best.
Yeah.
It is still midwinter, a long time until spring. There is much more to endure before the hour of deliverance. In fact, the suffering has just now really begun. That is what the holidays mean to me. So you see what I'm saying? Like they just take Kierkegaard quotes and her mindless tweets, and hilarity ensues.
It's kind of clever, but
yeah. It's a one-trick pony joke.
Yeah. So Kierkegaard had a mission here. And he knew he had a mission, and his writings are clear that he had this mission. He compares himself sometimes to the poet. However, he compares himself in a contrary manner. The poet believes that a muse supplies him with thoughts and ideas, but this is not how he sees himself. Because God wasn't a muse. He knew, I think, that God, through the Holy Spirit, was giving him these ideas. But he never thought about God as his muse. But he did see him, this poetic side of himself, which we'll deal with a little bit later. He has a need for God to shield him from his wealth of thoughts that he had. With his feeble health, he had to remain in prayer quite a bit. An example was that he could sit down for 2 straight days without sleeping and write, without having enough time to contain his thoughts. You can probably relate to that, Luke. I know that you've spent some sleepless nights, maybe with a couple of hours of sleep at the most, trying to develop noetic and trying to even prepare for some of maybe your for your PhD as well. You've probably gone through a lot of sleepless nights.
Yep.
So you can relate to him there.
That's how I got the premature aging.
Yeah. So what was superior to his production was his obedience to God. And what he means there is the only thing, and he was a very, very productive author, but the only thing he sees that was superior to his productivity was his obedience to God. It was not that God inserted thoughts in him, though. Okay, but because of his relationship, because it was an inward reflection that created this dynamic. So it wasn't that he was like a robot sitting there writing things and God would just push ideas in his mind. But these ideas came about because of his inward reflection on God that created this dynamic, this ability for him to not only hear the ideas of God, but to be able to write them. And there's a difference. Many times I may hear the ideas of God telling me things, but to be able to write them or re-speak them to someone else is really difficult sometimes. But he was able to do that. Yes?
It's interesting to me. I don't know how my own experience matches up to what you're reading into or getting out of the reading of Kierkegaard, but I have a very good life. I don't really want for anything, but I was very much impressed by the example. It was Solomon, right, in the Bible, who prays for wisdom, right?
Yeah.
It was Solomon, right? And,
Solomon, yeah.
And because he prays for wisdom and asks for nothing else. Do I have the story right? Like he's actually blessed with everything else, like by tenfold. Do I have the story right?
I don't remember the whole entire story, so I can't confirm it, but it sounds right.
Well, anywho, he doesn't pray for riches or power or anything like that. He just asks for God for wisdom, and he ends up being one of the wisest, most powerful people that there ever was. I pray to God for wisdom a lot.
Yeah.
For discernment and wisdom. And what I find after I do that is that there are moments of inspiration that open up. A new way of seeing things, a new avenue, a new possibility, a new corridor to develop things. And then once it's opened up, I find myself running through that door.
Yeah.
So at least the way I see it working within my own life, when I pray for wisdom and I feel like God directs me, is that He'll place the eureka moment in front of me, and then it's up to me to sort of go chase it.
Excellent. That's excellent, because that's what it's all about.
Do you feel like there's?
We have
do
to
you feel like it's parallel?
Yeah,
do you feel like that parallels what Kierkegaard's experiencing?
Yeah. God doesn't give us knowledge or wisdom just for the sake of having knowledge, making us smart. He gives it to us so, like you said, that we open the doors for us so we can now take another step on that path. I mean, it's never just dumb. It's never just done for the sake of knowledge itself. It's done for the sake of transformation. So yes, absolutely right. When we hear that kind of knowledge, even if it comes to ourselves, we have to act upon it. And so you're very, very wise to be able to know that. That is an important differentiation to make. On page 69.
Well, I got it from the Bible. I didn't invent it or anything. I'm imitating Solomon.
But he's someone that's a good role model to take, and not easy to imitate either. But that's a good thing to pick him.
I believe I found Solomon's prayer for wisdom in 1 Kings chapter 3. I'm going to look it over while you talk some, but then I want to share it with people because I think it's important.
Yes, please.
So, not this moment. You keep going, and I'll chime in.
I'm going to read from page 69, the bottom of 69. The dialectical factor in this is that whatever extraordinary gift may have been entrusted to me, it was entrusted as a precautionary measure with such elasticity that if I were not to obey, it would strike me dead. This kind of reflects a little bit of what you were saying there, that God gives him this extraordinary gift, and he looks at it as though it's such a treasure that if he were not to obey and not to use it, that he would be stricken dead. So he saw this as a very serious condition. He didn't see his gift as just kind of a worldly thing for him to use for his own ego's sake or to show off. It was something much deeper than that for him. God has been his one confidant, he says. He found bliss alone in this world because wherever he was, whether in a crowd or with a friend, he was always clad in the costume of his deceit. So he felt alone in the darkness of this night. This is such great poetry here. He doesn't even trying to write poetry, but this is so beautiful that when he's with other people or even with his friends, he still sees that there's always this costume of deceit around, and it always made him feel alone. Even when it was other people's, because he could see this deceit all around him. He says that without God, his imaginations would have driven him to madness, even unto death, when he thought about the meaninglessness of his existence. You can tell this is a man who definitely not only thinks, but meditates and reflects upon every idea that God has given him. He squeezes out every bit that he can get out of these ideas, out of these gifts that God gives to him. This is really important. Some of us, I think, God tells us something and we take it and we write it down and that's the end of it. But with Kierkegaard, he takes it and he thinks about it, and he's just like a lemon or an orange. He just keeps grinding it until he gets every bit of juice out of this piece of information God has given him. And I think his writings reflect that when we think about it.
He's definitely not wasteful.
No, he is not wasteful with these ideas. Now, there were times that he couldn't make himself intelligible even to himself, which is something I can relate to. But he couldn't even understand what he was saying. I guess he just got so far ahead of himself, and some of the information that God had given him was even above his own understanding. And
it raises again interesting questions of the compartmentalization of mind and the difference between inspiration and wisdom and understanding, right? Like that we can, that we can say things and we're like, whoa, where did that come from? But at the same time, not necessarily have the discernment or understanding to fully grasp the ramification of everything that we just said. I used to have this happen all the time when I played music. When I was doing, bands and stuff back in the day. You'd have this moment where you would be able to do something and you're just like, where did that even come from? And are you even going to replicate this thing that you perform spontaneously? So I think we like to think of the mind as this this totality that doesn't have different aspects of it that outrun one another, But I think it's very much the case that inspiration and recitation and communications of things can outpass our true grasp of those things we're trying to articulate.
Yeah, I believe that. Sometimes what we're given, though, Luke, I think that's evidence that what we're given is not always a gift for us. Sometimes it's a gift for other people who may be able to appreciate it even more than we can appreciate it.
Sometimes we're just messengers. Sometimes
absolutely.
We're couriers, and that message may not even be for us.
Absolutely right. I'm glad that you have that perception. His relationship with God was so personal that there were not words with which he could express it. So he had such a deep love for God, and he recognized the depth of God's love for him, that he knew there were no words that were going to be able to express it without making without making it sound cheaper. And that's one of the difficulties. Sometimes when we try to express these very tender, these very deep experience that we have with God, when we try to put it into words, we cheapen it. And that's the danger, I guess, of trying to express those kinds of divine things. He seems to give you going to say something, Lou?
Yeah, I was like, do you mind if I share this scripture real quick, because I think it might be helpful.
No, that's okay. We can stop here for a moment.
Yeah, it only took me 3 minutes tops. But I was mentioning Solomon's prayer for wisdom in 1 Kings chapter 3. I'll limit it to verses 5 through 15. And the reason why I want to bring this up is that I think it will help clarify some of these topics that we're talking about here with Kierkegaard. But if people haven't had a chance to read the Bible in its entirety, I didn't do it until I was 37 years old, so it's a hard thing to get around to do. I think this is a very important thing for people to have an understanding of, because I only came across it as a result of reading the Bible. So it says, "In Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, 'Ask what I shall give thee.' And Solomon said, 'Thou hast shewed unto thy servant David my father great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth and in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with thee. And thou hast kept for him this great kindness, that thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father, and I am but a little child. I know not how to go out or come in. And thy servant is in the midst of thy people, which thou hast chosen. a great people that cannot be numbered nor counted for multitude. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad, for who is able to judge this thy so great a people? And the speech pleased the Lord, that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said unto him, Because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked for thyself long life, neither hast asked riches for thyself, nor hast asked the life of thine enemies, but hast asked for thyself understanding to discern judgment. Behold, I have done according to thy words. Lo, I have given thee a wise and an understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. And I have also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. And if thou wilt walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments as thy father did walk, then I will lengthen thy days. And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and offered peace offerings and made a feast to all his servants. I just think that is so cool because Solomon, with the purest of intentions and heart, at least at this moment in his life, asked for something very simple: wisdom, understanding, be able to discern and judge between good and bad. And God really likes it when you ask for pure things.
Yeah,
I think that's just a really wonderful story, because I think people need to be okay with knowing that it's all right to ask God for wisdom. But I think people always think that Christianity is just all about self-denial all the time.
Yeah.
And if God can sense purity in your heart, he may elevate you.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I think that's why that's a very important story. So,
well, that's certainly the lesson there. And when you were reading that, what jumped out at me here is the words that were chosen specifically. Is God had given him a wise and understanding heart, not mind. Yeah. And
they're different.
And he gave him a wise and understanding heart. So I think that's a wonderful thing we can pray for. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. There's so many of these stories and prayers that are going on in the Bible. It's just so hard. We lose track of them. I do anyway. So thank you for bringing that back to my memory.
No problem. I needed to have my memory jogged with it too. It's even more beautiful than I remember.
Oh yeah. He seems to give a contrast between genius and reflection. If one has genius, he does not have reflection, because true reflection is negation of immediacy. Now, immediacy is the need for immediate satisfaction or reward. Immediacy is to be without reflection. So it seems that he's saying we have genius on one side and reflection on the other. And genius requires
that makes sense, right?
immediacy, whereas reflection, gives us that patience and the ability to wait. And not. Did you get that from that? I don't know if you studied that particular paragraph there, but I think he says this in other places too. He talks about genius, and he kind of compares it or contrasts it with between genius and between reflection. Do you remember that idea in anywhere else of his works?
I the specifics escape me, but it would seem to make sense, and if that genius would be tied to immediacy, right? Like, I think of someone like Amadeus Mozart, right?
Okay.
He just seemed to have this preternatural ability to play the piano,
yeah.
But from I'm going off of the movie Amadeus, right? He was like a very immature person who didn't seem to have a lot of reflection, right?
Yeah, right.
So it's very possible to have advanced gifts and still be lodged in aesthetical categories of immediacy.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, I think that's the key word you just brought up, the aesthetics. I think what he's telling us is that the genius has a more proclivity to be involved in those things which give you immediate rewards, right. Rather than the things that you meditate upon. And that doesn't mean that you can't be a genius and be reflective. It only means that, like, if you pursue the genius, you have to give up the reflective. So I think that's what he's trying to say.
Or many don't cultivate it because they don't need to.
Okay.
Their genius, I think their genius carries them a great deal in life, right? Like, think about how many people within our society have some markings of genius, right?
Yeah.
But are sort of in a juvenile arrested state, right? Like,
well, they see, perhaps the thought came to me that maybe they're looking at it is that what can my genius do for me, kind of an idea. And they're seeing this gift in a purely selfish way of thinking rather than reflecting upon it. They're seeing it as something they can produce, they can market this skill somehow. Right,
and if Kierkegaard hadn't had the religious education drummed into him by his father, who knows? We might be talking about Kierkegaard in the same breath with, like, I don't know, Oscar Wilde.
Yeah.
Rather than the way that we're talking about him today.
Yeah, he certainly had the writing ability to write something like that. Absolutely. He knew that there was governance in his writings. Remember that governance is the idea that God was overlooking over his life and actions. So he knew that God was watching. Of course, God was more than watching. He was helping, working with Kierkegaard. And he had this idea. He knew that this was happening. And I'm sure that it influenced him. He says that one must put aside the poetic and the philosophic nature to become a Christian. Do you think that he would have made a good monk, Luke? We talked about this earlier. Do you think that he talks about giving up the poetic and the philosophic and the immediacy? Do you think that he would have done well in a monastery?
No. He was a monk in some ways, right?
He was. Yes, he was. In his
right,
own,
right.
Yeah.
He didn't have conjugal relations, and he was separated. But I think he would have. I think there was too much of an outward ascetic uniformity that was going on in the monastery, and not to mention that I don't think he could embrace authentically embrace Catholicism. Right?
Well,
now maybe there.
Yeah.
What I'm saying here, I have a hard time believing that he would be able to shave his head and do the self-flagellation and wear the robes or whatever order he would have. I think he would have started fights with that whatever monkish commune he was in.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was he was good to live on his own off of his inheritance. He had the right situation for him.
I think that he. Well, I guess if we say, what might one of the problems be being a monk isolated in a monastery? It might be to take this self-reflection too far and become so isolated that you become involved in solipsism, where you're the only one who really counts, and your salvation and your spirituality is really the only important thing. But for Kierkegaard, what drove him, what motivated him, was he saw what was going on around him and he wanted to change it. And that was really behind all his writings. It wasn't just he was reflecting and going to write this manifesto for the future for everybody to read. It was that he really had a practical side to this. He really wanted to change what was going on in his world. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think that's what, I'm not sure, I think it's part of the reason why he would go into town, even despite the fact that, he was ridiculed as a religious fanatic and all these other things that he mentions, is that I think he probably saw it as part of his religious calling that if, a lower class person wanted to have a conversation about religious matters, that he would make himself available to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think he would have been a bad monk, because I don't in that respect, because I'm not sure he, as limited as his interaction was with greater society, I think he felt there was some part of his religious mission that involved meeting with common folk and helping them in those conversations, despite the ridicule that he would receive.
Yeah.
Don't you think that was part of a little bit? I'm not sure it was a major part of his air quotes ministry, but I think it played a factor. I mean, that's part of what I got from this book.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think you and I offline, we talked about things that I think both of us have at moments in our lives thought about being a monk might be at least a temporary solution for us, or at least a place sometimes to get away from everything and to reflect. Maybe not for the rest of our lives, but sometimes it appeared like it could be a place to kind of regain my own sanity, right? To get away from the world. Right. So I think it can serve a purpose. But now it seems as though where he's going with this a little bit is that the poetic and the philosophic, he says we have to deny the poetic and the philosophic life, which I'm not sure how you would take that, being a philosopher, but he puts those into the category of the aesthetic, the poetic and the philosophic. Did you notice that? Yeah,
and you know what? I think I've grown comfortable with that idea. I wouldn't put it, there, I guess what I want to say is this, right? Like, there are a lot of people who absorb a ton of sports, right? Mm-hmm. And it's sort of a blue-collar aesthetics. And don't get me wrong, I used to be a huge Washington Redskins football fan, so...
I remember.
I've been there. I have since changed, not because I'm dissatisfied with the team, but because of these epiphanies that I keep having in my life. These dang epiphanies. But you can see how that and poetry and the ballet and opera and things like that can be a distraction from a greater life's work. And similarly, you can think that you can work up a head of steam and believe you're doing something very, very important when you're arguing for the Hegelian system and contemplating the totality of all world history by tapping into the spirit or whatever. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. My mind's changing on this in the light of a lot of revelations that are coming out right now, which I can't speak of or I'll lose all credibility. One has to wonder if all this endless philosophical debate is to preoccupy men of elevated IQ so that they don't actually engage in their life's purpose. Their true life. If it becomes sort of a white-collar aesthetics in some way, if it becomes some sort of a non-violent football match when we have the real work of God to do. We're sitting here splitting hairs over ontological arguments for the existence of God when there's really a greater calling that we're not answering. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's a form of escape, but it's an intellectual escape. Instead of going to a football game, you sit there and you ponder higher thoughts, and it may make you feel better, but you're right. There is really no answer to some of these questions, and you spend a lot of your life thinking about them. Well,
there are answers, but if you refuse, here's the problem. There are answers, but if you refuse, if you're only going to use your rational faculty, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm going through and I'm reading all these JSTOR articles for the website right now, okay? And they're they're going round and round about empiricism or different other epistemological theories and blah, 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 blah. But they ultimately all have to conclude there's no rational basis for any of them, that it's all based on proclivity. So they're pretty much acknowledging the futility of all philosophical endeavor. And I'm screaming at these papers. I'm just like, hey guys, you've got reason. Wouldn't it be great if you took reason and put it together with revelation?
Yeah.
Think about what you could do. Think about the problems you could solve. Think about the mysteries you could unlock if you took this brain that God gave you with the revealed word.
Yeah.
And they're like, but that's dismissed out of hand, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot we can say about the influence of philosophy upon the church and upon even individual believers. So we'll save that for another session. Once a person becomes a Christian, he says, the religious is present and has a predominance over the aesthetic, but it waits for the poet in him to burn out. So, when a person becomes a Christian, you now enter into this religious state, which is or has a predominance over the aesthetic state. So instead of seeking the things that bring sensual pleasure, you now seek the things that give you spiritual pleasure. Pleasure to the heart and the soul and the spirit, rather than pleasure to the flesh. But he says, it's interesting here, this last little phrase here, he says, but it waits for the poet in him to burn out. So it's like it doesn't happen immediately. So when a person becomes a Christian, there's still some of the aesthetic left. And this, he calls it the poet, but I think we can broaden it to the aesthetic period, is still on fire in the individual. Even though the religious has predominance, it needs a little time to settle down to create the right balance. And he says that if he were to judge this age, he would say that it lacks religious education, that the becoming a Christian has become a triviality, and the aesthetic has the upper hand. So is this not true today, that the aesthetic has overtaken the religious?
Do you really want me to answer that? I think you know the answer.
Yes, but let's talk about it for a minute, anyway, because that's what we do. That's what we do.
Bob, you and I hang out together, so you and I may think that we're normal. Do you know how crazy? Like when I talk to people about, hey, let's read the Bible. The Bible's really cool, or whatever else, you know, I'm like, or someone asks me about something about free will. I'm like, yeah, you know, I see more scriptural support for predestination or whatever, or whatever else. I mean, I get looks like I'm some sort of crazy fanatic.
Yeah.
You know? So you're asking this question, like, is it still the case that we live in a highly ironical society where the aesthetic is winning out over the religious more than ever? I can't even get professing Christians to read the Bible. They don't even think it's relevant. They're like, oh, I read John 3:16. I'm good. I read that verse. I'm done.
I've said the sinner's prayer, so it's all over. I'm saved. Nothing left. But you know, that's what we do here, Luke. I see this as a ministry for both of us, to try to wake up people into realizing that salvation, that moment of getting in touch with God, that deeper reflection about God, is the beginning. And there's so much out there for people to say, I don't need to read the Bible. I don't need to really reflect on these holy things about God. It's just time to sing and rejoice and do all this stuff. And yes, there's time for that. But there's so much left about Christianity that I don't think a lot of believers are aware of. At least I've experienced that. And I know you have as well. So, well, let me continue on. We'll leave it at that. He says we've got into a refined intellectual paganism with a little Christianity in it. And I've got that bolded. I've got that.
Yeah, we're just coming out of Christmas.
Yeah, intellectual paganism with a little Christianity. That's the danger of philosophy too. Philosophy.
Oh yeah.
Philosophy.
Oh heck yeah.
Yes, it gives us that sense of being intellectual, but it's really probably closer to paganism than it is to Christianity. But they put a little bit of scripture in it, and they throw it in there, and then they preach it, and they think they're really preaching the Word of God. But what they're doing is they're giving us the power of positive thinking. They're giving us this, what was the other word? I can't think of the other one. But it is
Gnosticism? Or?
Yeah, well, this power of positive thinking rolled up with philosophy and a few scriptures in there, and everybody thinks this is Christianity, but it isn't.
No.
Just because you throw some sayings of Jesus into a pile of philosophy doesn't make it Christianity.
Well, now you're diminishing philosophy by associating it with the power of positive thinking. This is this new age guru nonsense. But I think it goes way back. One of the papers that I just recorded for the website was a great article it's called From Philo to Plotinus. It's all about how the early church fathers struggled with how to integrate or not integrate Platonic thinking, and how some of them tried so hard. They believed they could sort of rationally derive that one of the proofs of Christianity was that they had that the pagan Greek philosophers had almost derived like the Trinity without any sort of revelation or anything like that. And that these were some of the real debates that were going on at this time. That syncretization of different thought systems were happening very, very early on. And I don't think I ever understood. I've said this elsewhere, and I don't think I really understood it fully until this year. Is what Pascal said, that the God of Abraham, Joseph, and Isaac is not the same God as the God of the philosophers, something to that effect.
Yeah.
And I can't emphasize that enough to this audience, that when a pagan Greek philosopher talks about God, they are not talking about Yahweh.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They may somehow get translated the same way, but and then to try to make them match, that's going to just lead to this wild chimera that you're never going to really successfully raise up.
Right.
So you're going to have to choose at some point.
Right. Now, the task that he wants to propose to Christendom is to get them away from the poet and speculation. And this seems to show his relationship between the poet and the philosopher. So what he's trying to do here, Luke, he's trying to propose to Christendom, which is this syncretistic form of Christianity that's kind of blended a whole bunch of different things into its Christian world, is to try to get them away from the poet and the speculation. And I think poet and speculation are euphemisms for, I'm not sure what the poet is, but the speculation is obviously from the systematic thinking, systematic theology, as well as systematic philosophy of Hegel and so forth. I'm not sure what he means by the poet here. Do you have any? Can you give us a little information on what you think he means by the poet, to get us away from the poet and speculation?
Well, yeah, the speculation, right, is, like you said, I think he was pretty obsessed with Hegel, so to make sure that church doctrine didn't get twisted into whatever Hegel was saying, right?
Yeah.
Because that was a strong temptation, because that was infecting all the intellectual life of Copenhagen and Europe at that time, and presumably was infecting the seminaries, and then trickle down the ministers and then the congregation, as much as they had any interest in it. The poet, I'm trying to think precisely who he has in mind, but what I've noticed in reading a lot of poetry is that a lot of poets will take the Bible as a departure point, will speak very openly about devils and angels and this and that. But they get so caught up in their dream world that they're obviously going to start stepping away from true doctrine at some point. They're going to get caught up in their fantasy land. So,
well, while you were talking there, and my mind was just kind of racing along here, I'm thinking maybe he means that the poet, what he does, he tends to maybe pretty up the Gospels to make it more palatable, more acceptable, rather than preserve the conflict within it.
But the conflict, and that's the problem, right? Is you got to preserve the conflict, right? Like, you can't, like, this is the thing, like, I want the truth. I don't want this prettied up. Like, all my life I was taught sort of a sanitized version of so many biblical events, like be it the flood or whatever else. And Kierkegaard's like, no, right. Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. He was going to slice his throat and burn him.
Yeah.
Okay? Deal with it. Figure that out. Deal with that if you can. Right? Like, Or like with Noah's Ark or whatever, like, you know, we have these like sanitized images of like,
yes,
you know, like the real story to that is much darker from my research, much darker and more interesting than we were ever really led to know. But we have this like bathtub version of that we learned as kids of Noah's Ark, and if you study it, it's a much more fascinating and macabre story than I was ever taught in any church setting.
Yeah, but the poet tends to want to clean it up. And I think he says that earlier. I think we talked about it earlier when he talks about the poet. But the poet tends to clean it up to make it more presentable, to make it more beautiful. But when the gospel is beautiful the way it is. It doesn't need the poet.
That's like adding to the gospel.
It is,
which we're strictly prohibited from doing.
Okay, so now I have a question for you. Do you think it's important, though, still to study philosophy? And if you do, why? Why would you recommend somebody take classes in philosophy? Not necessarily a PhD like you, but if you were to say so, if somebody said, should I take any classes in philosophy? Would you say, yeah, I think that's a great idea, take a few classes in philosophy? Or would you say, no, stay away from it?
This is an open question because with many of the revelations that are coming out about the true nature of reality, all our institutions are going to have to reevaluate what their teaching aims are. And much of what has been built on as secular knowledge as being true is going to have to be rethought. Everything from astrophysics to evolutionary biology to philosophy. And it actually would be a really wonderful endeavor. Someone's going to need to write this book is like, you know, I'm not going to say it, but after blank and philosophy, right? I'll say this. I won't be able to issue any sort of general remark because each philosopher's thinking is too nuanced and profound, and that's what it's going to take. You're going to have to go through every single philosopher and see what is still of some value in light of new revelations or rediscoveries, we should say. So, for instance, there may be some aspects of Kant's anthropology that may be salvageable, but his metaphysics is out the window. I'm not saying that's the case. But if I were to speak in general terms...
Yeah, that's kind of what I was after.
I would say... Yeah, if I were to speak in general terms, I think that there is still... That the philosophy of religion is still very viable. Will remain very viable in light of the rediscovery. And the question is, well, why is that going to be valuable? Why is the philosophy of religion going to be valuable? And I would say, from an evangelism point of view, people are going to have a lot more questions about God than they ever did before because their minds are going to be turned towards the spiritual, And individuals like us need to have answers for them. And we need to have convincing answers for them. So we need to be learned scholars in order to win new people for Christ. Very educated people who are going to be reconsidering a lot of their axioms of reality. So from a point of evangelization, we need to have our doctrine and explanations of doctrine down cold. But I think for us, I don't think the mysteries of God ever really cease. I don't think, in light of the rediscovery, I don't think it necessarily resolves the issue of predestination. I don't think it necessarily resolves the problem of evil. I still don't think it necessarily resolves the exact dynamics that were going on in the garden. So, I don't know. I think it could actually be a really exciting area of research. I think if everything else sort of becomes delimited, a lot more brilliant minds could pour into that, and maybe we could make some headway on some issues that we had stalled out on for many years because so many brilliant people were spread out over other areas of philosophy. So, and so long as all of that philosophy serves to glorify God, to bring us closer to an understanding of God, I still think it's a good thing. So that's my long-winded answer as to why I think some element of philosophy will survive into the future and why we ought to still study it. But philosophy as a whole, we got to do a case-by-case analysis on each philosopher, and much of secular philosophy is now in trouble.
Yeah. No, well put. Thank you. I see it, philosophy, like I see mathematics. When we learn mathematics, it develops our thinking. It develops us. I think philosophy, I'm glad I took it, because for me, and I can't speak for everybody, I was very naive, and I really had a problem separating what was truthful from what wasn't truthful. And I found that studying philosophy helped me to be able to recognize the imitation. In other words, I can see somebody now and I can say, well, you're going down the Kantian path. Okay. Oh, no, you're going down the Descartes path. And I can see where people's thinking are now kind of taking very similar roads. And then I know how to handle it. I know how to deal with it because I can see it. So philosophy has helped me in that way. I haven't studied it to the same level that you have, but it's helped me because it's developed my thinking process, and it's given me a certain confidence now of understanding. So for me, I would recommend generally taking, some introduction to philosophy classes and logic and that kind of stuff, but not as an end in itself. Not as though, okay, you take these classes and you're going to find somebody, one of the philosophers is going to solve all your problems. Take one of these systematic philosophies and everything is going to be solved. But I think it's a good experience for many people. Maybe not everybody. I certainly can't speak to everybody. But for me, it was helpful. So what he wants to do here is he wants to get those Christians away from the speculative system, which was Hegel and any other philosophical systems. And I would even include systematic theology in there as well. Now, he explains, kind of shifts a little bit here. He explains how it was that he became an author. He believed that he was predisposed to be an author from very childhood. He admits that he was very melancholy, but he hid it by his humor. And melancholy is kind of an old-fashioned word that means depressed. He just had melancholia, which was a sense of depression. In his case, it was kind of serious, and it was long-lasting. It wasn't just he felt depressed one day, as we'll find out here. No one was able to discover how unhappy he really was. It's because of this that he took solace in God. So for him, he didn't have all these neat drugs that we have today, that you see advertised on TV to make you happy and to make your life perfect. he had to deal with it. And the way he dealt with it is he allowed it to drive him towards God. And perhaps if we didn't have all these drugs, maybe we'd have the same situation. People would be driven closer to God for their answers. But nevertheless,
you think?
Yeah, I know that there's clinical. Yeah.
I mean, look, I'm not against all of psychiatry.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are people who are in need of serious help, but I mean, so many of these drugs put us in a stupor, and when you're put into a stupor, there's no inner propulsion towards reaching out towards your maker. You know, I mean, doesn't the Bible warn us about pharmakia?
Yeah, pharmakia. It comes in different forms. Pharmakia is sorcery. It's a term. When you read sorcery in the Bible, the Greek word is pharmakia. Yeah, exactly. Very good. So in his youth, he saw Christianity as an inhuman cruelty, but he always revered it. Even before he made a conscious choice to become a Christian, he never broke from it or renounced it. So these kind of interesting ideas that as he was a child, I guess he didn't consider himself fully committed to Christianity at that point. So he had that aha moment at one point in his life that he decided to become a Christian. But even before that moment, he never really put it down or broke away from it. It's like he always knew it was right, but he just didn't commit to it up until that moment in his time. He wanted to employ all his power to defend Christianity and present it in its true form, which is not often done today. I think most betray it, or many betray it in the way that we spoke about earlier. Today, Christendom is not only a caricature, and I think this is what Kierkegaard talked about Christendom. He said it was a caricature of itself. The way I would say it today is that Christendom today is not only a caricature, but a parody of itself, where imitation reigns. Does that make sense to you, Luke? Can you reflect on what I've just said here?
Say it to me again. Okay. I was looking up sorcery and drugs in the Bible.
Okay, because
my two favorite things.
I want to see whether I captured the moment here in this phrase. Today, Christendom is not only a caricature, but a parody of itself, where imitation reigns.
I mean, yeah. But the imitation has varied forms, right?
Yeah.
Like, look, I'm not trying to sit here and bash anybody's form of organized religion or whatever, but the early Christians in Christ were not doing the things that we see in megachurches. Mm-hmm. You know, we're not. I know I'm going to catch slack. I know I'm going to catch slack for this, but is that me or you, Bob?
Yeah, it's not anyway. I don't hear anything.
I've got some volume on my end, but I think it might be one of my websites that I have open. Going back to the point I was trying to make is that there are poor imitations of what seem to be true Christian life that pass for Christendom today, and they take on a multiplicity of forms, and that can be everything from the laser rock show of the megachurch to the python handling of certain denominations to the high services of, I hate to say this, of the Catholic Church because it's going to sound like anti-Catholic, but you look at the Catholic Church and that doesn't seem to be what Christianity was intended to be. I mean, you've got saints and Mary worship and all sorts. I'll stop it there. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and what I was trying to make, the point I'm trying to make is not to criticize those that are going in that direction, but merely to draw people out of that, like Kierkegaard wanted to do. The idea is, I think people need to know you don't have to imitate what you see. There's something original for you. Christianity can offer you originality. So you don't need to imitate what you're seeing. And that's so easy to do. Because one of the first things that many young Christians ask is, what do I do now? And it's very difficult for them to be original in that state because they're looking to follow. And so I think I feel it's my responsibility, our responsibility, to let them know that you don't need to copy what's already there. You can find, you and the Holy Spirit create your own intimacy. And you need to get intimate with God separate from everybody else. And that's a difficult thing to do, is to see your Christianity as unique. So that's the only reason I'm bringing this up. Not to bash anybody, but just to say, don't imitate. Don't believe things just to imitate, because this is really the power of the cults, Luke. The cults.
Well, what would you say? Yeah, but what would you say to someone? They're like, "Hey, Luke, thanks for bashing my mega church or my pilgrimages to the Vatican, or my snake handling or whatever else." Like that. What would you say if they were like, "Well, that actually brings me closer to God"?
Well, I'd say that's what you need to ask yourself, that question. I mean, it's not for me to judge where a person belongs and what church they should belong to, but just to put the seed of that in a person is, be original. Are you doing this because they're doing it, or are you doing this because the Holy Spirit is leading you to do it? And I think we need to make that differentiation. I had to make that, and sometimes it's a very costly decision, but I think we need to get people to think that through and say, if you want to do that and belong to that group, that's your choice. But I want you to do it not because you feel you have to do it, because like I was starting to say before, one of the things I've investigated is many of the cultic versions of Christianity without mentioning them. And what I've seen is their power is to get you to imitate, to get you to feel the need to imitate what they're doing and not think for yourself. Let them do the thinking for you. And so that's what I'm trying to warn people. It's not just in the cult. It can be anywhere. It's not a good way to think. You need to step out on your own and develop that relationship with God towards the religious way of thinking, as Kierkegaard would say, rather than the aesthetic.
What the Catholics would say to us protesters is that they say, well, because you have this mentality, you can't get any cohesive doctrine amongst all of you, right? Is that because you're trusting so much in your individualistic experience, you can't. You're more inclined to go off into cults.
Well,
right? Because
that might be true if I was looking for a doctrine, and that is one thing that I also see is common among the cults. They disparage Roman Catholicism about all the faults that they have in order to convince people that their doctrine is the correct doctrine. If I'm looking for a doctrine, I am vulnerable to that. But I'm not looking for a doctrine. I'm looking for the person of Christ. I'm looking for the Holy Spirit and the being of God. These are existential reality, not an intellectual reality.
Right.
And this was the problem when the early church began to mix itself in with pagan ideas as well as philosophy. And that was the problem. So I'm not looking for another philosophy in Christ. I'm looking for the person of Christ. And so that satisfies me. So that's kind of what I throw out to others. He said that he knows he was intellectually favored and was very self-confident, but he had a predilection for suffering He never felt deserted by his faith, but depression was the exception. So he always felt that God was with him, but the thorn in his flesh, so to speak, we'll talk about, the thorn in his flesh was depression. He just couldn't get rid of this depression. It just hung over him. So he was never really free, he says, even for one day. So it appears that the suffering and self-abasement are what brought him to a deeper sense of the meaning of his life and his need for his relationship with God to explain it. As Paul tells us, when he complained to God about this thorn in his flesh, God said, "My grace is sufficient unto you." And apparently Kierkegaard had that same experience, that whatever caused this depression, God did not relieve it. And instead, apparently told him, "My grace is sufficient for you." And this depression was a means of motivation for him. It kind of pushed him closer to God. He always felt that his destiny was martyrdom. He felt that he was an observer of life and was able to see special insight into others. Have you ever had that feeling? When I read that, I kind of related to that. Sometimes I feel like an observer of life, and I just stand back from everybody and I look at them and I say, oh my, what's going on? Do you have those moments?
Yes. Yes.
Well, he never had immediacy in the human sense of the word. He was born with reflection. And this means that he always looked into himself, which made him different from the others. So he knew he was different from the others. And when he stepped back and he said, "What's going on here?" the difference was he reflected on himself. He took things in his life and thought about them very deeply. Life wasn't an entertainment for him. And I think that's a great thing to put in the category as the aesthetic. Can you imagine that if we lump that in now, that changes the picture, doesn't it? If we add entertainment into the idea of being aesthetic, just think about where that puts us in our faith and in our religion.
That's huge. It's huge.
It's a huge thing that we need to be careful of. So I'll leave that there. Continuing on, he did not long for his childhood as many do, but was glad that it was over, as am I. He thought that his intellectual gifts were thorns in the flesh. I talked about that. He could have meant here that his intellectual gifts were more a burden than a gift, because of the responsibility that he felt because of them. So we're kind of left with this idea of what does he mean that his intellectual gifts were thorns in the flesh?
Well, I think one way to, is interesting because it's an expression. It's an expression in the Bible, right? Didn't Paul talk about having a thorn in the flesh?
Yeah.
So then we have to and I think there's some debate over what Paul's thorn in the flesh was and how we understand this expression. Mm-hmm. I think it's typically referred to as lust, right? I mean, I think that's sort of the common understanding. That common understanding is not necessarily correct.
Right.
But I think, look, I've got thorns in the flesh. But the way that I would sort of understand it in the context that I exist in now, and maybe that Kierkegaard had it then, is like, when you have a thorn in the flesh, you can't get too comfortable, right?
Right.
Like, it puts you into a state of hyper awareness, mm-hmm. and might lead to that ability where you feel like you're hovering above, society and able to see things that everybody else can't see because they get too caught up mm-hmm. in the entertainment that is life. And it's pretty hard to do that when you've got things jabbing you in the side.
Oh, yes, it is.
And I wrestle with this a lot because, like, my whole side is torn up with thorns. And I wonder, I wonder, I have a birthday coming up, which I'm like, wow, this was one crazy year in terms of an awakening and stuff like that. And I wonder to myself, I was like, will I ever enjoy life again? Or will I just have will I live the next half of my life in complete restlessness because I have these thorns in my side? That's part of how I understand the expression of thorn in the flesh now, and it's not the same way that I understood it, say, a year ago.
Yeah. Now, I was just thinking the thorn in the flesh, and I was picturing Jesus, and I was thinking the thorns in his flesh. You remember they made the crown of thorns.
The crown of thorns, yeah.
Okay, now, if it relates to that at all, it has this paradoxical meaning. It was pain for Jesus. It was a disgrace for Jesus. It was mockery for Jesus. Yet, it was his crown, crowning him as the king of the world. So it had like these two things. Not only it was a disgrace and it was painful and all this, but at the same time, it was his king. It made him who he was.
It's an acknowledgement of a special purpose.
Yeah, it was God's way of saying, you can't take it away. Even if you mock it, he's still king. So I think we need to look at the thorns in our flesh in the same way. They can be irritating and aggravating, but they can be our crowning moment as well.
Right, and without them, do we do anything great without them?
Right. So we shouldn't complain, and that's what God was telling him. He was telling him that my grace is sufficient for you. The thorn stays, Paul. He complains that he had everything except his freedom from depression. He prayed every day to perform the work that God assigned him, and this is the reason that he became an author. So for Kierkegaard, he says everything is dialectical, which means to come to conclusions through reason. He didn't have much of a childhood, and it seemed to him that he skipped right through it. We know from reading about him that he really didn't have much of a childhood. His father wouldn't let him play with the other kids, so he wasn't even allowed outside to play without his father taking him for walks. That was his playtime. And so he never had a childhood. Instead of becoming a child, he became a poet with a predilection to the religious. He understood himself in this context of the religious, that his religiousness nullified him as a poet. So, as a poet, it was something, he says, that it was kind of a transition for him that was going to only transition through the religious life. And I think that's what he's reflecting on now, back to his childhood. Where did it all begin? Well, it began when he thought of himself as a poet. And then when he became religious, he sees, wait a second, a poet wasn't meant to be the end of itself. It was only meant to be the beginning. It was something that I'd have to transition out of because of my religiousness. So someone who fantasizes or is somewhat speculative, I think is what he means by this poet. Someone who beautifies things with words. So he felt that this was necessary for his political strengths to diminish so that his religious strengths could come about. And let's see here. Let me continue just a little bit further. Even when his poetical works are being written, he was writing them as a religious author. So even though when we read them, we see his aesthetical side, his poetical side, he was writing them from the point of view as a religious author. And this was only, again, for him to transition the reader from the poetic or aesthetic way of life into the religious way of life. He wanted to be, and here he explains a little bit about his poetry. He wanted to be a poet and then become a country pastor. But that really didn't work very well. So my question is, why do you think it didn't work well when he took a job as a pastor in the country?
I mean, I think we tackled this a little bit last time. But I mean, look, I think he had too much of a problem with. I think he would have told too many uncomfortable truths. I think he would have rattled the congregation, and I think he would have rattled his higher ups. Mm-hmm. I think he would have done nothing but create controversy for himself.
Yeah, he would have got a lot of complaints, obviously. People wouldn't have gotten him. I don't think that people really wanted to go to the churches he's going to. I don't think people wanted to go there to see the conflict of the gospel, to be confronted with the gospel. I think they went there to hear the poet.
Right.
They went there to hear Kierkegaard if he was going to pretty it up, give us a Hallmark version of the gospel. Little baby Jesus and all that kind of stuff, and Easter eggs and that. That's what they wanted to hear in those days. And he just wasn't capable of doing that. He just wasn't capable. So I think that's a good place to leave off right here. I think we've got about an hour and a half, so...
Yeah, it's a good long session.
Yeah, we can finish it up next week. I mean, in 2 weeks, I think we can finish it up at our next session.
Sounds good, buddy. I liked it. It was always a great conversation. Thank you for leading the conversation today. And Bob's been really great as I play make-believe CEO, and although things are really accelerating, but good. Man, it's a lot of work, Bob. I'll tell you what, making an intellectual social platform is no easy thing. So, but we're making some good progress, I can report.
Good.
If you're out there and you want to beta test the noetic.online website and check that out, that'd be great. You can also just listen to the materials that we've been making on the original version of the Noetic app and on SoundCloud and YouTube. Things are a little scattered at the moment. We've got to do a mass transition of materials from different platforms into our own. I won't bore you with any details, but it's a lot of work. So I'm going to get back to it. I'm going to edit this, and I'm going to have it available online and the first version of the Noetic app, and just keep chopping wood. So thanks again, Bob.
Thank you, Luke.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.